During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the only thing standing between two superpowers and a nuclear exchange was a U-2 spy plane in a photography run, flying slow, unarmed, and alone over SA-2 missile batteries. It's October 1962, and two missiles lock onto Captain Gerald McElmoyle's U-2 Dragon Lady. He throws the aircraft into a hard, evasive turn as both warheads detonate close enough to shake the airframe. He lands in Florida, ready to report, but a 3-star general has specific orders. This never happened. He could not tell anyone. But now, over a nuclear flashpoint just 90 miles from the United States, he could not stay quiet. The missile site that fired on him is still there, and they need evidence. The photographs would decide whether the world went to war. In the early 1950s, the United States had almost no reliable intelligence on the Soviet Union. With no way of knowing the true size of the Soviet bomber and missile arsenal, Eisenhower approved the development of a purpose-built, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, and in a groundbreaking first, handed control of it not to the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, but to the Central Intelligence Agency. With congressional budgets and inter-service rivalries out of the way, Clarence Kelly Johnson, the chief engineer at Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division in California, designed and built the aircraft in only 18 months. Meanwhile, the CIA was recruiting a handful of civilian pilots for the program, men who had to resign their commissions before joining, so the government could deny any involvement should anything go wrong. At last, by 1956, the world's greatest spy plane, the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady, was deployed to West Germany, ready to fly. With a maximum operational altitude of 70,000 feet, the CIA was confident the aircraft would be effectively invisible to Soviet radar. On the morning of Independence Day, 1956, CIA pilot Hervey Stockman climbed into his cockpit at Wiesbaden Air Base. The outriggers dropped away the instant the wheels left the runway, and he climbed almost vertically, the sky turning from blue to black as the atmosphere thinned around him. For a decade, the Soviet Union had been a wall. Whatever was behind it, bomber fleets, missile sites, military installations, up until that moment, Washington could only guess. Within minutes, he was above the weather. The Russian motherland spread out below him in every direction, 300 miles of it visible at once. Crossing over its rivers, railways, and military installations, the U-2's camera, running quietly in the bay behind his seat, began working automatically, while Stockman held course and watched, free to do nothing but look at a country his government had been flying blind against for a decade. Despite the CIA's calculations, the Soviets picked him up on radar within minutes of crossing the border. What they could not do, however, was reach it. Nothing could at the time. Still, MiG fighters scrambled and climbed as high as their engines would push them, through the drift site. Stockman watched them coming up, contrails streaming, engines starving for oxygen, until one by one they flamed out and fell away. When the film was reviewed in Washington, what it showed stopped people cold. The photos proved that the supposed Soviet bomber force that had been keeping American generals awake at night, driving billions in defense spending, pushing Eisenhower toward a massive expansion of B-52 production, simply did not exist. It was all a bluff. That same night, CIA headquarters sent word to the detachment at Wiesbaden that a second mission was going the following morning. However, most of the pilots were deep into the holiday celebrations, drinking the night away. Of the 6 men in the entire world capable of flying the aircraft, only Carmine Vito had had a single drink. Now, he'd be heading off to Moscow. To prepare for his journey to the most heavily defended city on Earth, Pilot Vito was up before dawn for the obligatory pre-mission meal, followed by 2 hours of breathing pure oxygen through a hose to purge the nitrogen from his blood. After climbing into the cockpit at exactly 5:26 a.m. on July 5th, the U-2 Dragon Lady lifted off from Wiesbaden and turned east. Vito followed the railroad line from Minsk toward Moscow, alone at thousands of feet, with nothing but a Soviet radio broadcast for company. The city appeared below through a layer of smog and haze. The camera filters cut through it, recording everything. Once again, 5 Soviet fighters were scrambled to intercept the U-2. The lead aircraft aborted takeoff, ran off the runway, and exploded, while its wingman flew through the flames and bailed out just in time. 2 more fighters took off, were refueled in the air, then got lost or collided with each other, and both pilots bailed out. A 5th launched, couldn't find its tanker, and was never found. Not a single one of them got close. On the way home, Canadian radar picked up the U-2. Vito heard a calm voice come through, quote, "Lone Ranger, this is Tonto. Keep heading the way you are going. You have 22 minutes to touchdown." Under the strict radio silence rule, Vito did not respond. He brought back images of the Feely airframe plant, where the Soviets were assembling their first jet bomber, a rocket engine plant at Khimki, a missile facility at Kaliningrad, and a bomber arsenal at Ramenskoye. In less than 48 hours, the program had photographed the Soviet military-industrial complex from Leningrad to the gates of Moscow, and nothing the Soviets sent up had touched it. With so much potential for spy work in their hands, the question for Washington was no longer whether to keep flying. It was how much further they were willing to go. In 1957, the United States Air Force began recruiting its own Dragon Lady pilots alongside the CIA's ongoing operations. Unlike the original CIA recruits, these men kept their military commissions, and the orders they received were deliberately vague. Wear civilian clothes, leave your military identification at home, fly commercially to Boston, take a train 40 miles west to Worcester, Massachusetts, and wait. Once there, a car would meet them and drive them to the David Clark Company, a manufacturer of women's brassieres, where they were measured and fitted for their pressure suits overnight and told to come back in the morning to collect them. By the time they finally arrived at Groom Lake, the CIA pilots already there refused to share a single piece of knowledge about the aircraft. Instead, these Air Force men had to create their own checklists from scratch and complete their entire training by themselves. That same year, the CIA launched Operation Soft Touch, the most ambitious series of overflights the program had ever attempted. The targets this time were not bomber bases or naval shipyards, but the Soviet nuclear complex itself. Uranium mines, weapon test sites, missile facilities, the infrastructure of a nuclear arsenal that Washington could only guess at. As the deeper they flew, the harder it would be to explain away if something went wrong. To reduce the risk of detection, the aircraft were fitted with radar-absorbent materials and routed from entirely new directions, coming in from Turkey and Japan rather than West Germany. On August 5th, the second day of the operation, pilot Eugene Buster Evans followed the railway line southeast across the Kazakh steppe. Below him, there was nothing but flat land in every direction, empty and featureless for hundreds of miles. Until a vast construction site appeared out of the emptiness, cranes and gantries and railway spurs cutting through terrain that Western intelligence had no record of, not even rumors. Evans kept the camera running and flew his route. Unknown to him, he had just become the first to photograph what the world would soon come to know as the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the launch site of Sputnik 2 months later, and Yuri Gagarin's flight 4 years after that. Later that year, another pilot, James Charbonneau, was flying over a Soviet nuclear test site in Kazakhstan when he saw a Soviet atomic bomb sitting on its launch tower on the ground below him. A mere 4 hours after he passed over, the Soviets detonated it. Though the program was producing intelligence that nobody in Washington had imagined possible 2 years earlier, Eisenhower worried that the risk of a shootdown, a capture, or a confrontation was starting to look less like a possibility and more like a matter of time. He shut it down for the time being. What Washington had not fully reckoned with was that while the U-2 had been watching the Soviets had been watching back. With every U-2 flight over the Soviet Union grounded due to rising tensions, the Soviets got to work. Across the USSR, construction crews were quietly installing a new surface-to-air missile system, the S-75 Dvina. Known to NATO as the SA-2 Guideline, it was a radar-guided missile standing 35 feet tall, capable of carrying a 400-pound warhead to altitudes no previous Soviet system had even come close to. By 1959, the Soviets could track aircraft at altitudes that had previously been invisible to them. and while the CIA knew the SA-2 existed, the consensus at headquarters was still the same. It couldn't reach the U-2. By the summer of 1959, after 16 months of silence, Eisenhower had a new problem. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had been telling anyone who would listen that the USSR was producing missiles at an unprecedented rate, and that Soviet military power had surpassed the West. Simply put, America was falling behind in a race it didn't even know it was running. In response to this threat, Eisenhower approved Operation Touchdown, a new series of missions targeting the Soviet missile program at Tyuratam, the vast facility that Buster Evans had stumbled across 2 years earlier. Though the photograph confirmed the Soviets were expanding the launch facilities of the mass ICBM production sites Khrushchev had been proudly boasting to the world, the cameras found nothing. From there, Touchdown pushed deeper into Soviet territory across 4 missions running into early the following year. On April 9, 1960, Air Force Major Bob Erickson crossed deep into the Pamir Mountains, one of the most remote stretches of terrain on Earth, photographing 4 classified military sites along the way. On the way out, a Soviet MiG-19 found him. Unlike the interceptors from the previous missions, this incoming attacker wasn't flaming out. It was closing in. Under complete radio silence, with absolutely no armament, and with no way to call for help, Pilot Erickson's only option was to push the throttle to the stops and hold on. At 528 miles per hour, the U-2 was going as fast as it could, while the MiG began to lose the climb, and the pilot was safe once more. Despite this close call, Eisenhower approved one final and major mission of a complete crossing of the entire Soviet Union from one end to the other, taking off from Peshawar, Pakistan, and landing in Bodo, Norway, with every major missile and nuclear site along the route photographed on the way through. For Operation Grand Slam, Francis Gary Powers, the most experienced man in the program, with 27 missions already under his belt, was selected as the pilot. On May 1, 1960, one of the most politically charged days in the Soviet calendar, while the Russians celebrated with a parade in Red Square attended by top dignitaries, including Soviet Premier Khrushchev, America launched their boldest mission yet. Like every Dragon Lady pilot, Powers carried a hollow silver dollar with a needle tipped with shellfish toxin hidden inside. Despite the incredible danger, according to Powers' account, quote, "It was considered worth the gamble. The planned route would take us deeper into Russia than we had ever gone, while traversing important targets never before photographed." 4 hours into the flight, with the autopilot engaged and the mission proceeding exactly as planned, Powers was 1,300 miles inside the Soviet Union, southeast of Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains. He confidently recorded figures in his flight log when a sudden violent shockwave hit the aircraft and a deafening noise, followed by a bright orange flash, filled his world. Reaching instinctively for the throttle with one hand and the controls with the other, the aircraft began spinning, inverted, nose pointing toward the sky. Powers reached for the self-destruct switch, but the 70-second delay timer meant the charges would go off before he could get clear. Ejecting required leaning forward to sever the oxygen hose first, but the G-forces from the spinning aircraft pinned him in place. In the end, the aircraft made the decision for him, breaking apart and throwing him clear of the cockpit. Tumbling for miles, parachute open, he fell towards Soviet soil. The Soviets had fired 14 SA-2 missiles, and though one brought down the U-2, another found a Soviet MiG-19 that had been scrambled to intercept Powers. In trying to shoot down an American spy plane, the Soviet Air Defense Network had shot down one of its own. Back in Washington, the CIA released a cover story before anyone knew whether he was still alive or not. To the public, a NASA weather research aircraft had gone missing over Turkey, with the pilot reporting oxygen problems before contact was lost. For days, the story held, until on May 7th, when Khrushchev showed Powers alive and on camera, along with the wreckage of the aircraft, the cameras, undeveloped film of Soviet military installations, even the CIA documentation. With their cover blown in front of the whole world, President Eisenhower took full public responsibility, marking the first time an American president had ever openly admitted to running an espionage operation against another nation. Powers was tried for espionage in Moscow on August 17th, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years. Although he only served 21 months before being exchanged for a Soviet intelligence officer. From there, the already strained relationship between the two world powers collapsed. Khrushchev walked out of the Paris Peace Summit. Eisenhower's planned visit to the Soviet Union was cancelled, and all Dragon Lady flights ended. It was official. America's U-2 was not untouchable. The program's future was suddenly completely uncertain. Though CIA acting director Marshall Carter did everything in his power to keep the program and block the transfer to the Air Force, the handover was inevitable. The U-2 would keep flying, but this time it had a new target: Cuba. Since 1960, U-2s had been making routine monthly passes over the island of Cuba under Project Nimbus, photographing airfields and military installations. Then, on August 29, 1962, a mission came back with something that hadn't been there a mere 24 days earlier: 8 SA-2 surface-to-air missile sites, fully under construction, spread across the island. The photographs were in the now President John F. Kennedy's daily intelligence brief 2 days later. CIA Director John McCone was convinced the SA-2 sites were there for one reason: to protect nuclear missiles that hadn't been photographed yet. But the western end of the island, where the activity was concentrated, had not yet been flown. He pushed hard for a mission over the San Cristobal area, only to be pushed back by senior officials, especially since another incident would not occur over the remote Soviet interior, but a mere 90 miles from the coast of Florida. McCone finally got his approval for October 14th, with the odds of losing a U-2 over Cuba at 1 in 6. That same morning, Air Force Major Richard Heiser climbed into his U-2 at Edwards Air Force Base in California for this politically charged mission. That day's route had been timed precisely for the low morning sun over western Cuba, which would cast shadows long enough to make ground installations readable on film. The Major took off in darkness, crossed the Gulf of Mexico, and entered this dangerous airspace in just under 30 minutes. Then he turned north, pushing hard for McCoy Air Force Base in Florida, where analysts were eagerly waiting for the film. Once there, analysts worked through the night. One senior analyst measured 6 large canvas-covered objects on Heiser's film 3 times because he didn't trust what he was seeing. 65 to 70 feet long, far too large for any known Soviet air defense system. What he was looking at were SS-4 medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles. The room went quiet. The following morning, Kennedy sat in the cabinet room with the photographs and a magnifying glass. He studied them, then looked up at Arthur Lundahl, the director of the National Photographic Intelligence Center, and asked if he was certain. Lundahl told him he'd never been more certain of anything. His strike weapons could reach Washington in under 20 minutes. In the days that followed, missions over the island accelerated. U-2s photographing Cuba from one end to the other. Anderson and Heiser were flying every other day, sometimes 6 aircraft in the air at once, the film going straight to Washington each time. It was the busiest reconnaissance operation the program had ever run. The photographs triggered 13 days that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it's ever been before or since. Soviet and American ships faced each other across a quarantine line in the Atlantic. Invasion plans were drawn up, and the world held its breath. On October 23rd, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson stood up at the United Nations Security Council and pinned enlarged U-2 photographs of Soviet missile sites on Cuban soil to a board in front of the entire world. The Soviet ambassador had been denying the missiles existed right up until the moment the images appeared in the room. For the first time in history, aerial reconnaissance photographs were used in a public forum to settle an international dispute. The Soviets had no answer. But the crisis was deepening, not resolving. By October 26th, the SA-2 sites that the U-2s had been photographing for weeks were fully operational. The pilots flying over them were never told. On October 25th, Air Force Captain Gerald McIlmoyle took off from McCoy and turned toward the SA-2 site near the port town of Banés in Cuba. He was already in his photography run over the target when he looked up and saw 2 SA-2 missiles climbing hard and fast toward him. He threw the U-2 into its evasive maneuver and watched both detonate approximately 1 mile away, then steadied the aircraft and turned north for home. McElmoyle was ready to report everything, but was stopped by a 3-star general with explicit instructions. He was not fired upon, and most importantly, he was not to breathe a word of it to the other pilots. The order lasted as long as it took him to walk back to the squadron, and though every single pilot believed him, not one of them seemed deterred. After all, the site near Banès had still not been photographed, and the crisis was too deep to leave it that way. That night, Major Rudolph Anderson sat down to plan his route for the following morning. He already carried 2 distinguished flying crosses for secret overflight missions during the Korean War, and had flown no less than 5 missions over Cuba since the crisis began. He knew exactly what the SA-2 could do, and had known since powers went down 2 years before. On October 27th, bad weather canceled every other mission on the schedule, leaving his as the only one still flying, over the only site that had already fired on an American pilot 2 days earlier. Still, Anderson climbed out with nothing but the sound of his own breathing. On Soviet radar screens across the island, a new contact appeared. They called it Target 33. The operators watched it cross Cuba on their scopes, reporting its position up the chain. As it passed directly over nuclear cruise missiles, positioned for a strike on Guantanamo Bay, weapons Washington didn't yet know existed. Moscow was called repeatedly for authorization to fire. Nobody answered. So the officer made the decision himself, and at precisely 10:19, 2 missiles climbed out of Banès into the Cuban sky. On the Soviet scopes, Target 33 continued moving for a moment, then began to fall. The operators tracked it all the way down to the ground, near the village of Vigitas. Back at McCoy, the other pilots waited and waited. As the hours came and went, Buddy Brown said aloud what everyone was already thinking, quote, "I don't know what happened, but Rudy should have been back by now." He never was. In the White House cabinet room, a worried Kennedy refused to authorize immediate retaliation. He wanted to know whether Moscow had ordered the shot or whether someone in Cuba had acted alone. Robert McNamara told the room that the military plan was now essentially an invasion. While they debated, Kennedy sent his brother to meet privately with the Soviet ambassador. A U-2 had been shot down, the pilot was lost, and there were 12 hours, possibly 24, before a response became unavoidable. In Moscow, Khrushchev received the news and immediately felt that the situation was slipping out of his control. His own men had fired without orders. Castro had sent him a cable that same day, asking him to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States. One downed American pilot had made the unthinkable feel suddenly completely real to both men. Within hours, they were looking for a way out of the same door. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. Kennedy would publicly pledge not to invade and privately agree to remove American missiles from Turkey. The most dangerous fortnight in history ended with a single casualty. Anderson's body was recovered by Cuban forces and returned to the United States. He was buried in his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, and posthumously awarded the Air Force Cross, the first time the newly created medal had ever been given to anyone. As it turned out, American signals teams had actually detected the SA-2 sites powering up their radars for the first time. By the time they confirmed what they were seeing, Anderson was already over the island. There was no common frequency between the teams and no system in place to reach him. From there, Strategic Air Command stood down all U-2 flights over Cuba until every aircraft in the program had been fitted with a proper radar warning system. The weapon that brought Anderson down would never catch a U-2 unprepared again. From there, the program flew on. Through the rest of the Cold War, through Vietnam, through the Yom Kippur War, through Lebanon, through the Iran-Iraq War. In Desert Storm in 1991, U-2s fitted with forward-looking infrared sensors and laser designators performed approximately 85% of all laser-guided bomb drops in the entire campaign. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works eventually produced a successor, the SR-71 Blackbird, capable of Mach 3. The Air Force retired it in 1998 anyway, when they proposed replacing the U-2 itself with an unmanned drone. The evaluation took years before the proposal was shelved. The drone couldn't match the sensor payload, couldn't loiter with the same endurance, and couldn't bring a pilot's judgment to what it saw below. In March 2026, BAE Systems was awarded a new contract to upgrade the U-2's defensive systems, with software capable of detecting and countering modern radar threats. Today, 70 years after Hervey Stockman climbed into his cockpit at Wiesbaden on the morning of Independence Day, the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady is still being updated to fly into contested airspace and come back with what the people making decisions need to see.